Okay, so yeah, welcome to the second episode of the Crosse Thinkers Podcast. And today we have the honor to have Dr. Scott Cooper from the biology department to join us. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Okay, so I find that this topic on the first year freshman seminar topics, and that sounds really interesting. It talk about living on the edge, the organisms in extreme environment. So can you tell us a little bit about what kind of organisms and what kind of extreme environment do you mean there?
Well, actually, in the class, we cover all range of organisms from bacteria and microbes all the way up to mammals. So all sorts of organisms adapt to extreme environments. And those extremes can be anywhere from high or low temperature, pressure, lack of oxygen, living in very dry climates, things like that. So adapting to all sorts of different physical extremes, physical extremes. Basically, anywhere we look for life on the planet, we find it.
Interesting. So, is it fair for me to say like the more advanced the animals are, like compared to like mammals compared to bacteria, the less adapted they are to the environment, or actually the stronger they are?
Well, definitely the microbes have an advantage. Being single-celled, they can go dormant for a long time. Their physiology can make it very, very simple if they need to. So I would say that there are actually so there are three domains of life now: bacteria, archaea, and then eukaryotes. So eukaryotes are the ones that have a nucleus, and the archaea are the often called extremophiles. So ophile just means they like it or love it. And so they're the ones we can find in the most extreme environments, like living in deep sea thermal vents, with hundreds of atmospheres of pressure and high temperatures and in bubbling hydrogen sulfide, so like conditions that any one of those would kill any mammal on the planet. They can survive in all three. But that said, for how complex mammals are, we find them adapting to all sorts of, very extreme environments.
Can you give me some examples about mammals? I'm particularly interested in that. Yeah.
Sure. Well, the ones that I work on are hibernating ground squirrels. So these are about twice the size of a chipmunk. If you are a University of Minnesota fan, that's the golden gopher. So they're actually not a gopher. If you ever see a gopher, you'll totally know the difference between the gophers are big moles. So the ground squirrels are about like a big chipmunk, about twice the size of a chipmunk. And they can hibernate in the winter, and they'll go down. So hiber is the Latin root for winter. So they basically overwinter. And they do it to avoid scarcity of food. So it's in the prairie in the wintertime, there's nothing for them to eat. There's 2 feet of snow. So they burrow down under the ground, and they'll live off body fat for 6 months. And to do this, they curl up in a little ball and go into torpor. And torpor is their body temp will drop to about 4 degrees. So they're normal.
Are you talking about Fahrenheit?
Celsius, yeah. So they're 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so refrigerator temperature. And normally their body temp would be like us, be 37 degrees Celsius, about 96 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're dropping their temperature from like your body temperature down to refrigerator, like pulling yogurt out of the fridge. It's that temperature. And their heart rate slows down dramatically. Their respiratory rate drops dramatically. Most other mammals, their pacemaker in your heart would stop at about 15 degrees Celsius. Their heart keeps beating. So they've adapted to temperatures, again, that would kill most mammals. The whole body temperature can get down like that. But then their metabolic demand is about 2% of normal. So they can make it for 6 months just off body fat.
So 2% as normal, that's almost like 6% divided by 50. 6 months divided by 50. That's actually how much they need for in terms of days, right?
Yep. So they'll still be burning fat. They don't drink the whole time. They're getting all their water from the fat they burn. So it's pretty remarkable adaptation.
Where can we find those kind of squirrels? I've never seen one.
Oh, they're around here. They live in Wisconsin.
Here?
Yeah, we catch ours at the Trempealeau Golf Course.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we bring them into the lab, and then it's like raising a lab animal. And then we put them in little Tupperware boxes and put them in the fridge in the winter. And they spend 6 months in a refrigerator. And then when they wake up in the spring, we take them back out again.
Totally makes sense, because I think here during the winter, actually, if you go outside, it's much lower temperature than in the refrigerator. Right?
Yeah, no, we tell people, 40 degrees, and they think that it's not the freezer, it's a refrigerator. But in Wisconsin, a refrigerator in the winter would be warm. And it's actually about the temp. If they go down a couple feet underground, that's about the temperature that the ground would be.
Okay.
So, and then they're in a little box, which would be like being in a hole. So it's actually very much simulates the burrow they would be in the winter. Yeah.
So what do you think made them to have those kind of capacities to survive in such a environment?
That's a good question. Yeah. So we actually think the ancestral mammal probably could hibernate. So if you go way back, to when all mammals had a common ancestor, that organism probably could hibernate, and it could have been to avoid food scarcity. It could have been to avoid predators for long, periods of time, because we actually see hibernation in most mammals, most branches of mammals. So we see it in bats. There are primates or lemurs that can hibernate. Several rodents. So all sorts of different animals can go into some type of hibernation. So the question was, did hibernation arise a whole bunch of times, or was it in the ancestor and it disappeared? The other thing with hibernators is the traits that allow them to hibernate are actually similar to traits we see in neonates, like newborns, and they've just maintained these traits. So the idea is that all organisms had this. They have it even when they're a newborn, but then most mammals lose it, and the ones that are hibernating have maintained them. So, for example, to warm up, a hibernating squirrel has huge brown fat deposits on their back, and they can mobilize those. They can burn those to warm back up. So they'll go from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 97 degree Fahrenheit body temp in 2 hours.
Okay.
So they can warm their whole body up 30, well, I always have to think Fahrenheit or Celsius. In Fahrenheit, they could warm their body temperature up about 50 degrees in just a couple of hours. So it's a huge amount of energy to have to burn. If you think of, like, if you get cold, your body temp has probably dropped a degree, and how much energy you need to warm back up again. Yeah, they're going orders of magnitude larger.
So it's basically like a wake-up system when they see the temperatures getting better, right?
Yeah, it'll actually be because they're in their burrow when they wake up. So their temp is still the same and it's dark. So there's actually, we don't know exactly the programming that gets them to come out, but it's not based on light or temperature because they're in the cold and dark when they wake up. So there's some kind of circadian rhythm that's built in there.
Somehow they know.
And it could be metabolic, that they're starting to run out of energy, and so they
have to wake up.
They have to wake up. Yeah.
Interesting. So tell me, like, the toughest organisms you know.
Sure. Well, again, I think the archaea are definitely the toughest. So with bacteria, it's hard to compete with them, and we find them, like I said, everywhere. They've been digging down miles under dirt, like underground, and they'll find bacteria. There are even some worms they're finding down, so even some animals they're finding down there. So probably the toughest would be the one I described. I don't remember the species name, but the some of the bacteria that can live in these deep sea thermal vents. So it's basically where the molten lava is kind of coming up to the surface of the seabed, and so all this hydrogen sulfide and everything is coming out of these tubes, and the bacteria can live right in that. And then there are worms that live just outside of that are feeding on the bacteria. So there's no sunlight down in these trenches. This is all, they call them chemoautotrophs, so they're living off the chemicals that are down there. There's no sunlight. And then there are animals around that feed off the bacteria that are growing in these deep sea thermal vents. They're also under, like I said, many atmospheres of pressure. Like, we don't even have submersibles that can get down that deep without being crushed, and their whole ecosystems living down there. I shouldn't say we don't have manned submersibles we can get down. We can get unmanned submersibles down that far, but we can't get manned ones down. It would crush anything we could make.
So when I think about those kind of things, it's like these are pretty tough ones, right?
These
because
really
they lived in a tough condition for millions of years or something like that.
Right, yep.
What will happen if you put those kind of tough ones into a nice environment? Are they going to just outcompete everybody?
No, actually, it's a very good question. Actually, most of them would die. We have that problem if we try to bring fish and things up from really deep, cold conditions up to the surface. They're adapted to that environment, and they'll actually die under those low pressures.
So it's not like tough or not tough. It's more about my environment and your environment.
Exactly.
Totally different.
Yep. We have fish in the Antarctic that don't actually have red blood cells. They have blood that circulates, but there are no cells in it because their oxygen dissolves better in cold water. So there's so much oxygen in that Arctic water that they actually don't need red cells to move oxygen around through their tissues. If you put them in a warmer environment, they'll die because they can't take up oxygen. There's not enough oxygen in the water for them to survive. So there are organisms that are adapted to a particular environment. Just because they're adapted to that tough environment doesn't mean they're tougher than other critters. They're just adapted to that ecosystem.
So let's say, like, with all this kind of research going on with all these tough creatures,
Mm-hmm.
how will that thing benefit us? Like, other than research point of view,
Sure.
knowing where we come from.
Right. No, there are lots of good examples of that. So, we actually have benefited a lot from this type of research already. But just to go back to the ground squirrels, one of the several things we could look at with humans, if you could put humans into a state of torpor, right, you could reduce their metabolic demands. That has applications in surgeries and transplants, things like that, right, because you could slow their a human's metabolism down, give you time to treat a disease, and then
Reduce
bring
the
them back
bleeding,
up.
probably.
They do that a little bit right now with some brain surgeries. They'll chill the patient. They'll chill their head or something like that to slow down the metabolism. They're really only dropping their temperature a few degrees, so they're not really going down into a deep torpor, but it does help. If you could really get a person into stasis like that, you could use it for space travel, right? So all the shows where the astronauts are in their little chambers, that would help. You could get.
So that thing's not sci-fi anymore.
Well, it's sci-fi in terms of we could chill somebody down. Getting them back out again is the hard part, right?
Okay.
So you could freeze a person, thawing them back out and having them be normal is the hard part. But there are people looking at that. We've already benefited from some of the studying extreme organisms. There's a reaction we use a lot in medicine and biotechnology called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. So it was in all the, if you watch those CSI shows where they're taking little cheek swabs from somebody, and they go back and run it in a machine and it looks at their DNA. That uses this technique. And the only reason it works is to do those steps, you have to heat the sample up a lot and then cool it and heat it and cool it. And enzymes normally can't survive that, but it's based on an enzyme from a bacteria that they got from the hot springs in Yellowstone. It could live in these geysers, and so its enzymes were adapted to that heat. And so they use that enzyme now in those reactions. Because they can take the cheek sample from a person, and that enzyme will make copies of its DNA, and then we can get enough to actually do a blood test or something like that. There are definitely applications we've already gotten from studying these extremophiles. Yeah.
Is there a way you can see, like, we can even speed up the thing up to a level that we can start genetic engineering something, or just start breeding things together?
Sure. So we can take pieces of DNA from one organism and put them into another. For some things that might help them adapt to a different environment, I think we do that already with plants. So they're breeding plants that are more resistant to all sorts of things, but drought and pesticides and all sorts of things. A lot of the adaptations, though, that we see in organisms aren't a single gene, right? So it's a whole suite of things that they've had to do to adapt to those extreme environments. So the example I use for PCR with the bacteria from the hot spring, we were just looking at one enzyme that it used. It has thousands of enzymes, and all of them have to be adapted to the heat. We just took one out to use it in an assay that's widely used now, like I said, in research and in medical applications, things like that, forensics. So to actually, if we just put that one enzyme into another bacteria and then tried to throw it into a hot spring, it wouldn't survive because all of its other enzymes would not be adapted.
So it's still like a reduction in them, like we just find one at a time and do a certain kind of function, but it's already beneficial enough.
Exactly, yeah, and there could be, these would be applications like outside of the cell that we're using. But yeah, I think there are lots of different things we're learning about how organisms adapt to high altitude, to living in high pressures, plants, for example, with high temperature. So the way I look at it, I use this analogy in class. Basically, nature's had 3.5 billion years to run hundreds of millions of experiments with these different species and found species that can adapt to all sorts of different environments. They've come up with all sorts of novel ways to do that. And our trick as scientists who study comparative physiology is to go around and look at the experiments have already been run. Here's the result. Can you figure out, how it works? So it's kind of like just running around looking at nature, but looking at it with a little bit different eye, and saying, well, that's, cool. Another example, there are frogs that live on the very northern end of their range, even around here, the spring peepers, the wood frogs, you'll hear them in the spring, all the little peeping. They can actually freeze solid during the winter. Their heart stops, no brain activity. You thaw them back out in the spring, and their heart starts beating again, and they basically come back to life. So these are amphibians that have learned how to survive in a very extreme environment, as far north as an amphibian can go, and still survive. So there are lots of cool, you make that observation, then all sorts of questions come out of it,
How did they do it?
Yeah, how do their cells not all get damaged by the ice? How does a heart stop and then start beating again on its own? There's no little electric shocks or anything like that, no pacemaker. So, how does their brain survive memories and things from being frozen?
So they still have the behaviors before restoring their brain?
They wake up and they start singing and peeping and, find a mate and find food. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to know, actually. Yeah, I never paid attention to so much like animals around me before. Like I see frogs, I just see one frog.
Yeah.
Not different kinds, but I am actually surprised to hear that some frogs can do that, which is totally beyond my imagination. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no. So all sorts of organisms are adapted to this. So you have warm-blooded organisms, cold-blooded. So we call them the warm-blooded would be endotherms. So their temperature is determined by their internal body
for the enzyme to work.
Production.
Yeah.
Ectotherms, their body temperature is determined more by the outside temperature. So ecto for out, and they'll have different adaptations, right? So a frog basically can't control its internal temperature at all, so it's going to just go down to whatever the outside is. A mammal could stay warm by burning more food, but then it could run out of food. You have different ways of getting oxygen. So mammals have to breathe. We have lungs. Frogs can get air through their skin. Turtles, reptiles are in between. So turtles hibernate as well. They'll get down under the mud in the bottom of a lake. And their heart rate will go down to just a couple beats per hour. And because they're underwater, they can't breathe through their lungs. They actually get oxygen exchange through their butt.
Really?
So the skin's thin enough there. That's the one place they don't have their carapace or their shell. And they get enough oxygen through that, and there's enough circulation that they can survive, basically being underwater with no oxygen and not taking a breath for months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so next time you see a turtle, you can appreciate that. It can breathe out of both ends. Yes.
That actually reminded me because one of my friend was basically a jerk, right?
Yeah.
There was one time he tried to electrify a turtle.
Oh, geez.
And the turtle actually started a fur. So now I know where all the gas come from. It's super bad smile.
Oh, yeah.
But that was a bad thing to do. But now
it
knowing
makes sense.
that, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so personally, I'm very interested in outer space and all the aliens and everything.
Yeah.
I just came up with this idea after seeing this title. Is just like think about going to Mars, or just making Mars to be habitable even before we go there.
Yep.
We can start to send animals or start to send some kind of organisms there.
Yep.
But because their environment is so severe, can we actually breed on purpose to engineer some kind of organism to send there to actually make that thing habitable for us?
Yep. So there are two questions there. One is, what could you actually send to Mars and have it still be alive when it got there? And then what could actually live on Mars?
Yep.
So living on Mars would be a challenge. You probably wouldn't be able to do an animal because they need oxygen. So actually probably, and also there's very, very little water from what we know. There could be some water. We're not actually even sure about that. So probably the thing to send first would be a lichen. That would be my guess. So a lichen is actually a symbiotic relationship. It's a fungus with an algae living inside of it. Okay. And it can grow on just pure rock. So there are lichens that live in Antarctica. So it's kind of similar to what you might get in Mars in terms of very low oxygen, very dry, potentially very cold. And the algae living inside can do photosynthesis, so they can produce energy. And then the lichen, the fungal part, protects the algae. And they're actually very resistant to radiation. So one of the reasons for that is we don't always think about this, but in Antarctica or the Arctic, they'll go through times of the year where they're in total darkness, but they'll go in times of the year it's 24 hours of daylight. So they get just bombarded with ultraviolet light during those really high photoperiod times, to the point where it can actually start to damage life forms. We think of plants as liking lots of light, but there's too much of a good thing as well. So lichens would be very resistant to that. And because they have the algae in there, they actually would start producing oxygen. So if you could get them there and get them long enough and you got enough of an atmosphere going, I don't know you'd ever create enough of to like colonize the whole planet. But if you could at least get some kind of a dome built and got some fungi and things growing in there for a while, you might be able to produce enough oxygen in there to start to do that. You can create enough lichens to sustain life. So that's what caribou and things eat up in the Arctic. It wouldn't be, sitting down to a nice, bunch of corn and mashed potatoes or something like that.
We're on Mars. What do we expect?
Exactly. yeah. But that would be one thing that could probably survive there. In terms of animals that you could get there, so they're with animals we have invertebrates. So those are animals that don't have a backbone. They're vertebrates that could be and then within the vertebrates you can have the ectotherms and the endotherms. So the simpler the organism, the more likely it would survive. There are probably worms and things that we could send pretty easily to Mars because they can go into some type of stasis. They'd be very, very hardy once we got there. Of course, we're the most interested in the warm-blooded vertebrates like us.
Eventually,
yeah. So there, actually, I would make another argument again for the ground squirrel because or something that hibernates. It's small. If you got it into torpor, into hibernation, it can make it for 6 months. You're down to 2% your oxygen demand and your metabolic demand. And most of the costs on a spaceship are life support. You have to maintain all that. You could get by with 1/50th the life support you would need otherwise. And then when it got there, if you timed it right, it would come out of torpor and be awake and running around. Also, they've shown that animals, when they're in torpor, are more resistant to radiation. And the reason is for radiation to cause damage to cells, it needs oxygen. So if you're in a low oxygen state, the radiation causes less damage. So if you get a radiation while you're in torpor, it damages you less than if you're awake. And there's lots of cosmic rays that would tend to pass through spaceships and things, no matter how kind of shielding you put on them, is you're probably aware of. So actually, a hibernating mammal would probably be the best thing to send. Now, what they do once they get there, I'm not sure.
Other than consume what the food is there, which is
eat
eventually for us.
Eat lichens, I guess. But if you wanted to show that a mammal could make it, that would be the one to probably start with.
That's beautiful because I was a big follower of the biosphere experiment.
Yeah.
So I was thinking like you put a box, you put everything that you can put in to make it like a sustainable environment. And then finally this thing can sustain itself in a glass box, which only consume from externally, only consume sunlight. Then you can actually send the whole box to Mars and try to see how long they can survive. But now actually we don't even need a box, right? We just need a one type of thing, send it there enough time.
If they could send something that, and again, I don't know how this would work, engineers could figure it out, but it lands and it's either like some kind of self-assembling dome or it inflates or something, and you could get some fungi in there. The water would be the tricky part. You'd need some water initially to get it going, and then just see if you could keep it somewhat shielded from the environment, because it's a very dry and very low atmosphere, so I think any moisture that got released would dissipate pretty quickly. But then you could just monitor inside of that dome and see, does it start producing oxygen? Can you get the moisture levels up a bit? And then maybe after a decade you could ship a couple ground squirrels, teach them how to eat lichen, and or actually Arctic ground squirrels would be good. They probably eat that naturally. They live up there. See if you could get them in, and again, not that you'd need them there, but just it would test if you could have a sustainable colony of something.
Are there research going on in this area? Like, are people thinking about doing this even?
I think they talk about it. The downside. So aside from just saying it'd be interesting to do, and you could monitor the mammals while they're there. It's not like you could really train them to do a whole lot that in terms of research or anything like that. So I'm not sure if there's a big push for it or not. I know I've been to conferences on living life in extreme environments, and some of the presenters there were from NASA.
Okay.
And they were more talking about adaptations humans have to long-term space travel. But we did have some interesting conversations over beers about sending a squirrel to space or
that would be
something like
cool.
that.
Yeah. Once they survive, the second round can be other mammals and eventually human, right? So for those kind of how to say, which are already pretty tough creatures, can we? I'm talking about bacteria or something like small. Can we actually breed them in the lab? And we create an even tougher, or like some environment we want to speed up the natural selection process or evolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, well, two things. Actually, it's an interesting question you raise. Some of these organisms that are adapted to these really extreme environments are actually hard for us to grow because we can't mimic those. Really,
it's too extreme.
Yeah, it's hard for us in the laboratory to mimic that environment. So there are bacteria that have been hard for us to culture. Like one example, I know they pull some up from Lake Vostok in Antarctica. So this is a lake, a freshwater lake, that's under 2 miles of ice, and so it hasn't been seen sunlight in over 2 million years because there's all this ice on top of it. They bored 2 miles through and took water samples from it, and they found thousands of different bacteria down there, but they're all living on this chemical cycles. Well, it turns out with it's under fairly high pressure, being under 2 miles of ice. There's no light, no oxygen, and when they pull those out and try to culture them, it's hard to mimic those conditions. Sometimes they have to grow them in special chambers where they pull all the oxygen out and some high pressure, and then they're not growing off. They can't just streak them on a regular plate full of sugar. They don't know what that is, so they're adapted to chemical environments and things. Not all of them, but some of them can be hard to grow. So that's the first challenge. Some of these extremophiles are just hard to grow in the lab. And then, sometimes it's hard to do better than evolution. So you could think of, well, what tougher environment do I want them to survive in? But then we'd have to think, okay, what proteins do we mutate or what genes do we mutate to make them tougher? Like I said before, nature's kind of already run that experiment. If you can find an environment, there are probably bacteria already living in it. So the challenge then would be, what environment are you looking for? And pretty much anywhere we've looked on the planet, we've found life.
Already, right?
So any environment we could imagine on our planet. So then it raises the question, okay, the one that we haven't found anything yet would be outer space. So can you find things that can survive in zero gravity? And that's where we know that we can take some organisms, we can put them out in zero gravity. They basically go into like a dormant state, and then when we bring them back into a regular environment, they come back to life. So we know they're capable of surviving being in space, but that doesn't mean that they're actually growing in space, like they're not dividing and replicating and metabolizing. So that would probably be the next step, was could you find something that could actually like go through life processes in space versus just surviving being in space. I don't know if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah. Because there'd be things that, like, if you took a human and threw them out in the vacuum of space and pulled them back in, they'd be dead. But there are some organisms that we can put out and bring them back. And
not only do you need to survive, you need to have functional purpose.
Right. So these tardigrades, they're the little water bears. They're a really, really small animal, but incredibly tough. They can handle radiation, low pressure, high pressure, lack of food, all sorts of things. They just go into this little dormant, kind of dried out state, and then when conditions get good, they pop back again. So we know that you can put them in space, bring them back in. Israel was sending a mission to the moon, and they had some tardigrades on board, and it crashed and spilled them all over. So we don't know if they survived the crash.
Yeah, some people are joking. Actually, the crash was on purpose.
Yeah, but they're probably tardigrades on the moon, and probably just anytime humans have gone anywhere, these things go with them. They're all over the place. Now, so that means they're there, and they might be in this dormant state. Are they going to be able to actually wake up and move around? Is there anything for them to eat? Everything needs some kind of water at some point. So it's entirely possible. Maybe they'll find a little niche somewhere that they can survive and grow, and there's a little population living up there. I don't know if we'll ever know that, but it's not out of the realm of possibilities. Yeah.
So thinking of that, actually, has human be able to find any sign of lives on any other
Not that
outer
I'm
space?
aware of. So the thing they look for first is water, because as far as we know, life requires water. That's an assumption on our part, right? Maybe there are forms of life that don't, but every form of life we know at some point needs some water, and preferably liquid water. But even if you have ice, there can be patches of liquid somewhere that they could access. You need some kind of energy supply, but we know now that doesn't have to be the sun. It could be chemical energy supplies. Most likely, the first things we would find would be bacteria. So you'd look for single cell organisms. So we have not found any yet. Pretty much the only place we've looked in with humans present would be the moon, and that's not the best place to look because it really has no atmosphere to speak of, and it's fairly small, orbiting our planet, so it's not as hospitable as a planet. Mars would be the next most likely place to look. We've had the rover running around; it's taken some samples, but I don't know that it was really equipped to actually find life itself.
But even actively looking with some kind of equipment? Or
right, yeah.
it's just by chance?
The trick would be how do you actually find it? So, one way would be a microscope. You'd have so any samples you collect, you'd have to look for microscopic. You could look for genetic information, but we'd have to assume they had the same system we have in order for us to detect it remotely. If we got it in the lab, we could figure out how it works. But if you're just looking around on a planet with a little rover, you're limited in the tools you have to actually look. And then the third would be just visually, if you saw great big mounds of something. But most bacteria, well, there are actually some really old evidence we have when it used to colonize and form these big mats. But a lot of the bacteria we see in the environment are in the single cell forms. So visually, you wouldn't know they're there, right? They're probably bacteria all over the place in here, but you can't see them. So it would be tricky to pick up unless you actually physically have scientists there, or you can bring samples back that they can look at in the lab. Trying to do this remotely would be tough. Yeah.
Cool. So you talk about a lot of interesting stuff about this kind of organisms and extreme conditions. But again, this is from a class. So let's say if I'm a student who took your class,
right,
I will know all these kind of fancy ideas and theories about this. Will I also have some opportunities to touch some of them, or just manipulate some of them? Or?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So you can do that mostly in independent research projects. So if you work with faculty members, and I show lots of videos in class to show them some of these different critters and how they adapt to their environments. But some of the things I can't bring into class. Like today, we were just looking at some that were like the kangaroo mice jumping around in the Southwest, and so lungfish that can wall up. This one actually walled up into a mud brick. It was made like an adobe brick, and then when it rained, it came back out. So stuff like that I can't do in class. But one thing I do is I show when we talk about different organisms. If we have a faculty member in our department who works on something related, I'll talk about that a little bit. So like today when I talked about hibernation, I talked a little bit about my work, and then Christine Schwartz, who studies the brains in hibernating ground squirrels. And so I talked a little bit about that, and I told students, if you're interested in this, here are some people on campus who are working on it. So that's probably the best way a student could get involved, would be through independent or undergraduate research. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I bet a lot of freshmen, after they seeing this, they definitely want to do that when they're ready, right? So,
I guess we'll find out. Yeah, this is the first time the class has been offered, the first year seminar. So, but that was one of my goals, was a couple things. One was to show students that there's just all these cool things out, and they've seen them on nature shows and stuff like that. But getting into it a little bit more systematically, a little more rigorously. What are the adaptations? What are they adapting to? How do different organisms do it? So really dig into it a little bit, but then also just open their eyes to the fact that this type of research, there are a lot of things we don't know. This type of research is still going on. There are people here doing it. There are applications to understanding humans, so we're not the most interesting critter on the planet from a physiological perspective. And there are we will do some human examples, but there are organisms that can adapt to things that we can't even come close to. We surround ourselves with technology and clothes and food and houses to survive in extreme environments, and these organisms just have.
So basically, we're changing the environment compared to we're changing ourselves.
That's been our model. Yes, the reason we're so successful is tools. We create tools to allow us to adapt or to exist in different environments. So we use our brain as a form of adaptation.
So do you think this actually slows down our evolution because we don't have to adapt to the environment anymore?
No, well, there's good. So there's the school of thought that. So evolution occurs through natural selection, which means you need to have some kind of challenge to individuals.
A lot of them need to die in order for that to proceed.
To survive. And so there's been some argument that with medicine, sanitation, and food supply, a lot of individuals who would not have survived 200 years, 1,000 years ago, are surviving now.
Mm-hmm.
So we've reduced the natural selective pressures, and so humans stopped evolving. There are other people that would there's another school of thought that would make the argument that we've just changed the selective pressures. So now we have a lot more chemicals in the environment. We have people are having children later in life.
Like culture selection, right?
There can be cultural selections. So some religious groups or ethnic groups or whatever have more kids than others. So it's much more complex now. It's not as simple as you need to find enough food to make it through the winter. Now there are all sorts of other things that can select whether or not individuals have children. And it's not survival of the fittest, it's actually reproduction of the fittest. So you could live to be 100, and if you didn't have any kids, and someone else lived to be 30 and had 6 kids, the person who lived to be 30 and had 6 kids is passing more of their traits on to the next generation. So we need to look at it a little bit differently than just survival, right? It's not just how long are people living or
meanings,
right? All sorts of other things have an impact. So I think we are probably still evolving, but not in the way we were even just 1,000 years ago. The selective pressures are much different now. I would probably even say 10,000 years ago when we started agriculture.
Simply just because we were too good during the past 10,000 years in terms of using tools, right?
Right. Okay. So, but even then, we've shown that humans have changed over the last 10,000 years in terms of size and stature.
What's
and
the
bone
most
mass.
significant change we can visually think about?
Yeah. So if you looked at humans pre-agriculture, we tended to be bigger boned. And there's much more difference in size between males and females. So males were much larger. Probably they had a hunter-gatherer had a pretty tough life, especially in northern climates. They were hunting large animals with hand tools
and extreme weather.
Yeah, in extreme weather and all that. So it was a very harsh environment. As we got into agriculture and people became more urban, those traits weren't as necessary, and so our bones density and things like that, or bone size, I believe is the right word, have gotten a little bit smaller. 10,000 years is a pretty short time evolutionarily, so you're not going to see profound changes like you would see comparing us to like more primitive or ancestral humans, Australopithecines and things like that. You're not going to see that big a change in 10,000 years, but there have been some changes. Even other examples, metabolically. We've seen lactose intolerance in some human lineages that we don't see in others, based on, did they start to domesticate cows and, raise milk or generate milk from that. So you can see some short-term changes that way that have occurred since the advent of agriculture. Yeah.
So, let's say this. I heard some interesting ideas about talking about evolution point of view, about, robots are going to replace us, or cyborg is probably the next way to go. Like you want to engineer your arm to be metallic, but you can still have a conscious brain. So do you see that is actually a possible or even a feasible way to to design our, instead of saying selection, natural
Right.
selection, we
Sure.
actually do this by design now.
Yeah. So again, there'd be a couple ways you could. So if you wanted to get into designing different humans, I'm not going to say better humans because I think we're
Yep.
pretty well adapted to our environment. But if you wanted to make some changes, one would be mechanically or with a cyborg, or putting some electronics into people, which we do a little bit already with artificial hips and knees and all sorts of things like that. So I think you could do that. It's again, like with most things, it's a lot harder than people think. So even if you give somebody an artificial hand and they're trying to get them now to where they can move their fingers with brain waves, it's very, very difficult, right? For people, they have to go through a lot of training to learn how to move their fingers on an artificial hand just with their brain waves. They're able to do it now, but it's really, really cumbersome. That could get better in terms of those interfaces, but to the point where a mechanical hand would work better than your regular hand, we're probably nowhere near that point to where someone would say, yeah, cut off my arm and give me an artificial hand.
Make it stronger, faster.
Yeah,
but actually, it's just not feasible.
I won't say it won't happen, but we're nowhere near that now. In fact, if somebody gets a severed hand, like in an accident or something, they still try to keep the hand and sew it back on because that sewn on back on hand, even if it has limited function, will still be better than an artificial hand at this point.
Yep.
So not to say it won't happen, but that I think we're still quite a ways off from that. The changes that could happen today are with some of our gene editing technologies, CRISPR. In fact, we have students in our molecular biology lab that use this technique to alter genes in cell lines. You could do that in humans, and there was a scientist in China who did this a couple years ago.
That was not an ethical thing to do.
Correct. Yep. So that's the issue with these technologies.
Yeah.
So they could go in and edit genes in an egg or a sperm, use it for fertilization, and now you've created an altered human being. And this is a simple enough technology that undergraduates do it in our classroom, but we're doing it on cells we grow in tissue culture that we throw away at the end of the experiment. We're never going to make them into a person.
Yep.
And there are downsides to any experiment you do. There are unintended consequences, right? So we know the gene we're trying to target, but every now and then it misses and it goes and hits something else. And it's those something else's that we don't know where it's going, that if you now made it into a person, maybe you wanted to fix this one gene, but you also altered another gene. And if you grow that up into a person, every cell in the
throw them
body
away.
has it.
Yeah.
You can't throw them away. You can't. There's no undo button once it's gone that far. So those are technologies we have now where we can go in and alter people's genes. And we don't even have to do it at the embryo level where it's a whole organism. A lot of gene therapy now to treat diseases would go in and target genes in an individual.
Yeah, for me, that's like obvious, like something we shouldn't be doing because of ethic issues. There are something we should be doing because it's basically, benefit everybody.
Right.
So one thing actually I kind of feel like is on the boundary, like we should or we should not do is actually, can we use genetic engineering to extend people's life in terms of like just make us live longer?
Sure.
Because I recently read a news about Japan. Like the Japanese government actually put this one to be one of the first priorities of the government to support research in stem cell.
Okay.
To make sure that everybody can live like, let's say 10 years longer.
Right.
It's like a healthy population, right?
Yep. So again, I'll always say that there are two ways of looking at it. So one would be we're already...
That's the good thing about being a scientist.
Exactly.
Right?
I got two hands, so I can say one hand and the other hand.
Don't ask me to pick, but I will tell you what happened if you pick this one.
Exactly. Yeah. So in a sense, we're already doing this, right, with modern medicine. Right? We're already extending everybody's life 10, 20 years just through, again, antibiotics, hygiene, lots of drugs that we give now. It used to be heart disease was the number one killer in the United States. I believe I just heard that this year cancer is now taken over. And the main reason for that is statin drugs and ACE inhibitors for lowering blood pressure. So we have people's cholesterol and blood pressure under control. and fewer of them are dying of heart attacks. If you don't die of a heart attack, you die of something else. So it's not that the rate of cancer has gone up, it's that the rate of heart attacks has gone down. And so now the number one killer is cancer. And we're working on cancer too, but we use all sorts of technologies right now to extend life. In terms of using stem cells or other, stem cells, gene therapy, CRISPR, any of these technologies, now you're going and you're biologically altering a human's body so that it's not an external drug we're giving them to extend their life. Whatever is extending their life is inside of their body. And once it's in there, we can't pull it back out again. We can stop giving somebody a drug, right, if we find out their side effects to the drug. Once we put something in their body, we can't, right? And
you
so
basically develop the circuit, the process, right,
well,
in
those
your
cells
body.
become part of the body, and you can't pull them back, right? Once they're in there, you're not going to go say, okay, I want those 10 cells out, because they're going to divide and grow. So any type of stem cell work, genetic engineering through CRISPR or whatever technology, gene therapy where we take a virus with the DNA we want and we put it in, then it goes and infects cells and puts the good gene in. All those things, once we launch them in the body, you're not going to pull them back again. So I would lump all those together. There's huge potential for those therapies. Stem cells would be one of them. If you have a patient who has a spinal cord injury or Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's or something where we could go and put, we have a very hard time getting neurons to grow in the body once you're an adult. If any of those diseases, if we could go and get the neurons to, where the spinal cord injury was, build new neurons, or where you've lost neurons in the brain, replace them, you could treat currently untreatable diseases. So most people would say, yep, that's a good thing. We should work on that. At the same time, the technologies we use to do that, you could use to try to make somebody taller, right?
Oh, yeah.
You could put in cells to try to do things like that. And so the challenge there becomes, when are we treating a disease and when are we doing like designer babies to try to, give somebody an advantage? And we've seen with even things like these recent college admissions scandals, parents will go to a lot to try to give their kids an edge. If there will be some that if they saw I could, my child could get this transplant when they're a kid and they're going to get a little more human growth hormone and be taller and bigger.
Smarter, yeah.
Or, smarter's a really tough one because we don't know any genetic link there. But whatever the trait was, parents could try to do that to give their kid an edge.
If you think about culture-wise, like we're talking about inequality here, at least we got the inequality in terms of wealth, inequality in terms of environments, school, education, anything. But now if like richer people can live longer.
Right. Or if they can give their kids what's perceived as an advantage in society, then you have genetic inequality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be a big issue here.
Yeah. And it would be expensive. I mean, it would be the kind of thing that probably only wealthy parents would do, either with insurance or through their own private contributions. Ethically, we're a long ways from that. But again, it is kind of a gray area, right? So some people would say, obviously treating a neurological disorder or a birth defect or something like that is pretty straightforward. Yes, we should try that. Other things, it's more of a gray area. Is it more cosmetic or, and that's not a scientific question. That's an ethical question. How do you do that and when do you do that?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned like it's hard to grow neurons, because recently I think I listened to a podcast. They were talking about something called brain organoid. It's basically they were trying to grow a brain out of a stem cell, and they could never do it. Somehow after like 20 generation or something like that, that thing started actually dysfunction as a brain.
Right.
So what they were trying to do is actually try to see if this thing can somehow show you some genetic features about this person. Then if you got a person with brain disease, you can basically start to breed a brain-like thing and try to see where it went wrong.
Okay.
Try to diagnose what's going on with the person's disease. Okay. But you cannot use that thing to actually treat people yet. Because it just, it's difficult.
Yeah, growing tissues, most tissues, if they have any type of structure to them, are really hard to grow. If it's just a mass of cells, it's a little bit easier. But most of the organs we'd be interested in working on are difficult. So the ones we've been able to culture, and you can do grafts, you can take cells from a patient, manipulate them, and put them back, tend to be a little bit less structural. So things like skin, liver, bone marrow, we can take cells out, put them back. Things like neurons and skeletal muscle, things like that are a little bit more challenging.
They need to unfold in a certain order, right?
Yeah, developmentally, the structure is hard to replicate. So what you tend to get are just, like you said, blobs of cells. And for some things, that's fine. If they just need to express a protein and it doesn't really, the structure doesn't matter that much. But like wiring in the brain is very different. And actually with the brain, that again, here you have to differentiate. If we have a neurological problem in a patient, was it neurodegenerative, meaning it happened in an adult, the brain was fully formed, and then it started breaking down. So that'd be like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or something. So structurally, the brain was okay when they were a child, but it degenerated over time. That would be compared to a developmental disorder where the brain never formed properly.
That would be the genetic one, right?
Yeah, so that would be one where it was inherited at childbirth and it never formed properly in the first place. So somebody with Parkinson's disease might not have had any problem with development. It developed just fine, and then this happened afterwards, or like somebody having a stroke or something like that. So you can end up with neurological disorders, but coming from very different ends. And
It's
so
more genetic or epigenetic.
Right. Yeah. So the developmental ones there, it could make sense where you could culture the cells and look at how they grow and try to get an understanding of what went wrong. But it might be that in an adult with a neurodegenerative disease, nothing went wrong during development. It all happened afterwards. So it's a little more complicated than like most things.
Interesting, yeah.
It's always more complicated, yeah.
So let's go back to virus. I hear this kind of, I don't know if it's like straight science or just science. It's just like as humans, we use so many medicines or antibiotics to target a certain kind of bacteria. So we kind of speed up the evolution process for bacteria.
Yep.
And some people actually start to make a claim that hospital is a really bad thing because you bring all the ill people together, sick people together, who are guaranteed to have multiple species of bacteria and let them compete in a very closed environment.
Right.
So is that even just like a feasible argument?
Oh yeah, no, that's reasonable. So there again two things to unpack there. So one's the whole antibiotic use. So antibiotics will treat bacteria, not viruses, but they get used inappropriately sometimes. So sometimes somebody will come in with a cold. It's a virus, but the doctor will give them an antibiotic. Half the time it's just because the patient says, give me something for this, and nothing else would work, so they give them an antibiotic. That's not that common. I think doctors are getting much better about that. Where we really overuse antibiotics is in agriculture. So we feed tremendous amounts of antibiotics to livestock. And two things. One is we have lots of livestock housed in a small area, so they're worried about infections. But there's also an effect that was noticed, I think back in the 60s or 70s, that if you gave animals antibiotics, they actually grew faster. They put on muscle faster. So they're actually giving them to stimulate growth more than anything. And they use a lot of the same antibiotics in these livestock that they use in humans. So basically, you're just running and what we're speeding up a little bit is evolution, but what we're really speeding up is natural selection. So we're selecting for the bacteria that are resistant to those antibiotics, right? And especially when we have millions of people and millions of farm animals all getting these antibiotics, the bacteria that survive are going to be the ones that are resistant. And they're then going to go and spread around. So misuse of antibiotics is leading to increased antibiotic resistance. And we're basically just keeping our head above water. We get like these MRSAs and things like that that are methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. That was like our last, antibiotic, and there'll be multi-drug resistant antibiotics floating around now. The second part is by bringing all these sick people into hospitals with these diseases, now we're just spreading them around. And there actually are pathogens that are more prevalent in hospitals than outside of hospitals. So you're more likely to get some of these infections in a hospital than outside of the hospital. And it's for the reasons you said, that you have lots of sick people. And there's only so much you can do to try to keep them from spreading these infections. There are doing things in hospitals. Some of them are less robust than others. I mean, they'll have people wear masks. That helps. They've found that actually having potted plants is bad because there'll be soil. Things will live in the soil. So a lot of them now, they're getting away from their plants and coming up with other systems. A lot of doctors have stopped wearing ties because they would wash their lab coat, they'd wash their shirt, but they hardly ever wash their tie.
Makes sense,
and it's dangling out there in people's faces. So these are, again, minor things, but washing. There are lots of things about washing hands now.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, you just constantly come here, glove, do stuff.
Exactly.
You have to get rid of the glove. Yeah.
So I think there are things like that they're trying to do, but the fact is you're bringing a whole bunch of sick people together in a confined space, and so So
that's the best we can do.
Those diseases are going to be more prevalent. There's only so much you can do short of everybody, being in their own building, and not having the doctors walk back and forth between patients. And for most people, the infections they're being exposed to probably aren't going to be a problem. But the second part of having all these sick people in is you have these sick people they might not be sick because they have an infection, but they're in a weakened condition from something else, and now they're more susceptible to those diseases. So you have somebody come in who, fell down and broke their hip, and they're elderly, and their immune system's weak, and now they get exposed to these infections in the hospital, and they acquire them in the hospital. Whereas if they'd been home, they probably wouldn't have gotten them. So, so there's that as well, that the people who come there might be more susceptible to picking up one of the infections that you or I probably could go and visit people and not get.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, one big question.
Okay.
My understanding for, let's say, physics, right? For the second thermodynamic law, we were saying the entropy of the world is actually growing one direction, never decreases. That means everything in the universe eventually will go from order to chaos. It's just like not order. So that's like entropy law.
Right, yeah.
And what I try to imagine what happens with biology is actually all these lives are trying to organize the environment together. So we actually go from chaos to order.
Right.
So now, given a big scale of time, let's say towards the end of the universe, billions of years, who do you think is going to win?
Well, so two things. I always have two things. So if you look on our planet, you're right. Entropy should be constantly increasing. But that's assuming there's no increase in energy input. And we get huge energy input from the sun.
Yep.
So the reason we do have any of the structural organization that we have at the cellular level is because of this huge energy input from the sun.
It's not a closed system.
It's not a closed. In each trophic level, well, it's not a closed system from energy. It's a fairly closed system in terms of materials, right? Atomically, we're more or less. But energy-wise, it's a constant input. And each trophic level you go up, you lose about 10%, right? So we're very inefficient. But there's so much coming in that allows us to create some level of structure from chaos. So on our daily basis, things aren't going to fall apart before us because of this constant input of energy. On the long-term scale, that's a bit out of my realm. You should get a physicist in here, astrophysicist, to talk to you.
I will ask them too. Yeah. I just want to see if from a biological
right. My understanding. So the galaxies and everything are moving apart from each other, and it's actually expanding at a faster and faster rate. And the question is, what happens? Does that just keep on going till things keep pushing the known universe?
Yeah, and then it's either come back, start to shrink, or they just, who knows?
Keep spreading,
right?
Yeah. But at some point in that respect, the energy will have to dissipate. And for us, it'll be when our sun fades, right? So in several billion years, when our sun fades. But there will be
probably other life structure carries our legacy, just keep going, right?
Could be, or we die out. So at that point, once there's less energy coming to the planet, then I think entropy would start to take over, right? Then things will unravel pretty quickly. But that's going to take quite a while. In terms of it, the galaxy-wise or universe-wide, I don't know that. Because, again, I've heard both theories, that it's going to expand and then it's going to contract back again, or it could just keep expanding and expanding. But at some point, even our sun, the energy being produced by it is going to wane. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. But in the short term, on our day-to-day basis, we can still be organized.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's actually encouraging.
Yeah.
I don't want to worry about problems which is even longer than the history of human, right? So.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So, do you believe in aliens? Do you believe in outer space life?
I'm sure there's some out there somewhere. Yeah. I mean, there's so many planets out there. The question and I can't remember whose. There was this one paradox about the odds of us ever
famous paradox.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, it's like he would be probability times probability, right?
Right. He would be the person to come up with it. Yeah, he was an interesting guy. So I'm sure it's out there. Whether we'll ever encounter it, us being technologically advanced to receive a signal from another group that's technologically advanced enough to send it, the probabilities of those occurring
at the same
time or within enough time that the signal could get from one to the other, those are the probabilities that are very, very low. But the probability that there is other group out there, and whether or not they're sentient beings or just, primordial ooze, I'm sure there's something out there.
So
somewhere.
Probably it's a stupid idea to actually keep sending signals to hoping other people understand. Signals.
I wouldn't invest a ton in it, but it doesn't hurt to try.
So do you have a better way to look for outer lives?
Well, I guess my question as a biologist would be, I understand that it'd be cool, right, as a biologist to try to understand the life that's out there. If we're doing it to try to find another place to live, my preference would be to try to keep the place we got, because odds are it's going to be really hard to colonize another place, and it would probably never be as good as Earth. And we could put a lot of energy into trying to not mess up the planet.
Are you following with the climate change and all this?
Everything: climate change, pollution, habitat loss.
Give us like a
fill in your spot.
Yeah.
So from a understanding foreign life part, it'd be really cool. The people that think we're gonna go and colonize another world, and that'll take because we've made this one uninhabitable. I think that's putting your energy in the wrong place.
So you're keeping up with all the climate change and everything. So tell us your view on how bad it is or how good it is, or should we even worry about it? How much should we worry about it? About basically the planet is trashed and we are the cancer on the planet. Which I totally don't believe. Some people say that.
I could see arguments actually for all of them. So the concern I have right now, I think scientists have been talking about this for, getting close to 50 years now. I mean, you go back to the 70s and 80s is when they first started bringing this up.
Who started it? Like physicists? Biologists?
Well, it was some oceanographer or like NOAA type people who study the atmosphere. And it was actually, I think the gentleman worked at the observatory in Kilauea on the Big Island in Hawaii.
Yep.
And he's the one who came up with the hockey puck graph and started.
Okay.
Because they're out in the middle of the ocean, no, industry around them or anything, and so they were measuring CO2 levels because they could get really clean measures of CO2 levels. Didn't matter which way the wind was blowing or anything, and they saw it steadily increasing. So he's the one who first, started the alarm about this. And even if you go, I can't remember now when Al Gore's election was. That would have been like in the 80s. He brought up inconvenient truth and all that. So that was quite a while ago. That was, so people have been bringing this up for decades, scientists and even some politicians. I think I just saw a poll now, it's just finally getting to where like 80% of Americans believe in climate change and think that humans are a major cause of it. So it's actually gotten to the mainstream now, which is good. The two questions that remain are, is it too late? Are they finally realizing the Titanic's sinking, when it's tilted 45 degrees?
Say, have you passed the threshold of there's no turning back?
Are we past a tipping point?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of scientists that say we probably are. we're past the point in temperature where even if we could shut things down now, it's still going to be 100 years of temperature increase. Just there's feedback loops in it. That would be one thing. The second would be, even though we realize that it's a problem, do we have the will to do anything about it? And this is going to come down to changing individual behaviors and getting governments to change. At least, at the very least, get governments to admit that it's a problem. And the very least, that'd be the very least, admit it's a problem, and then do something about it. And those are huge societal changes. I mean, we're very much a carbon, fossil fuel-based planet economy. And we're among the worst in the world, Americans, in terms of our per capita consumption. Our whole cities and infrastructures are built around the car and single-family homes with big yards, and flying planes all over the place and eating beef. So, everything we do is, you go down your checklist of things you're not supposed to do, and that's
probably you have 50 things already on your list.
That's what we do all the time. Yeah. So that sounds very pessimistic. I think humans have the capability to turn around really fast if we want, if we make it a priority. But I think that's the key. It has to become a priority, and I don't know that that's happened yet. And I think you need it almost has to be grassroots. It has to be citizens saying, yes, this needs to change, voting in politicians who will put together bills that make it happen. Some of it's going to have to be some tough decisions on our own side, like things like carbon taxes and stuff.
Basically, your life quality is going to go down.
Not necessarily. It's going to change.
Yeah.
It's going to change. So, if you look at most people, let's say they drive an SUV that gets 25 miles per gallon, would their life be any worse driving a Prius that gets 50 miles per gallon?
Or even take a bus.
Or bike. Probably not. It's going to be different. They aren't going to get or do they need a 4,000 square foot house? Could they have a 2,000 or 1,500? It's going to be different. And I think a lot of what we've done in the past couple decades have been on this excessive. The average house built in the U.S. right now is over 3,000 square feet.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I grew up in a house that was 1,200. That's about what we live in now. Like 1,600. People just have really everything's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't know that people are twice as happy as they were 20 years ago when they were living in houses that were half the size or driving cars that were smaller. So I would actually flip it around and say, prove to me that downsizing makes you less happy, and maybe focusing less on material things, more on experiences.
That's almost like an educational effort. It's just like, it's not like downsizing is going to make you unhappy. It's just like, if everybody's doing it, you see the benefit of doing it. It become more natural for you to doing it instead of saying like, it's just a change of value.
Right. And so I've had this discussion with people, and we're in fact, so at UWL, I work as a director for undergraduate research, and I just sent an email out to faculty this morning. We're working on the sustainability projects with the city. So the city's pledged to go carbon neutral by 2050.
Yep.
And some of the initial people I contacted about this were actually more in sociology, political science, psychology, environmental studies. I think the problem is dealing with climate change there's going to be less of a scientific solution, and it's more human behavior.
Yeah.
We know a lot of the solutions right now. We know the things we need to do. We have the technologies to do them. Can we get better solar panels? Sure. We'll get better batteries and better solar panels. But the quickest way to reduce energy consumption is actually not by creating solar panels and cars. It's by getting people to change their behaviors, right? And that you could do overnight. We could do that next year. We don't have to build a whole new smart grid. People could start changing their behavior very rapidly. But it's still hard to do. So I think it's more on us as individuals and less on scientists to make those changes.
Yeah, for me, the pessimistic part is if you rely on individuals. I think the only thing drives the individual's behavior right now, I'm thinking about the majority, is economic value.
Yeah, it's
really hard for, unless you put in a lot of educational effort, which I don't know how.
Right.
it's really hard for people to say it, for you to convince a person, let's say, just change the way.
Right.
This way is actually, I would still say like it's a little bit more expensive than what you had before.
Right.
But people just don't see that. It's just like, I want my room, I want my space, and all the stuff.
Well, so I think there are two parts. I always come back to two parts. But you're right. So it's more expensive, or there's a cost part.
Yeah.
But I think people are also being driven by kind of social norms. So it's actually more expensive to build a 3,000 square foot house than a 1,500 square foot house.
True.
So they weren't building that. They might have been building it because they wanted a little bit more space. But at some point, it's big enough that you've got rooms in the house you're not even using.
Yep.
So they're not building that house because they need the space. They're building it because their neighbors have it, or their brother-in-law has it, or something like that.
Social connections.
So I think a lot of it is more psychological. And same thing with cars. They want bigger cars for whatever reason. Well, they're not always. They're using a pickup truck as a commuter car. Yeah. Well, they're not hauling a boat every day to work, right? They could get by with a smaller car and just have the truck for something else.
Yeah, for me, that is going against all the advertisement I'm seeing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So that's why I bring up the economic. It's just like, hey, to drive the economy to grow, you need this direction, but kind of like you need to go the other direction to let the economy slow down a little bit.
So there's personal economy, and then there's the national economy, right? So for a personal economy, you're actually better off ignoring all those ads and looking at what's important to you in your life and focus your resources there, and don't feel like you have to have the biggest, newest everything. I mean, we drive a 15-year-old Prius with 300,000 miles on it, and I don't care. It gets me to work. So there's that. But I'm avoiding all those car ads for 15 years
on purpose, right? So you're like a strong person with strong mentality.
Well, no, I don't know about that, but it's just that's what you have to do to have that. From an economic perspective, you could say, yes, everybody buying bigger cars and bigger houses stimulates the economy. But I think those are some false senses of economy because they're not factoring in the environmental costs.
So you're saying, like, for economy, instead of looking at GDP, you need to also factor in people's
factor
happiness,
in everything, and
pollutions, and all
the
stuff.
Climate change is the huge cost coming from that.
That's really good.
We don't factor any of that into our GDP.
Yeah.
So you're right. If
we're looking at the wrong number, basically, right?
We're not collecting the right data and putting it into the equation. So if you do that, then some of these green alternatives actually become cost effective. And it's even getting now to where solar and wind are actually competing on a level playing ground with fossil fuels. Yeah. And fossil fuels are heavily, heavily subsidized. So they're getting now to where Texas is the biggest wind generator in the country. And this is oil country, right? But the power companies, they sharpen up their pencils and do the math and say, well, actually, wind is cheaper for us now than oil. Yep. And so that'll start to happen. I think more and more municipalities are putting in solar. Cities are so the local governments have to deal with climate change more than the national legislators, which is why the national people who are dealing with lobbyists are out of touch with mayors, right? Yeah. So there are mayors in red states that are, rebuilding levees for the fourth time or having, their third hurricane in 4 years. They're acknowledging climate change, right? Their representatives in Congress might not be, but the mayors have to deal with flooded streets or, fires or, big snowstorms, whatever it is. Yep. Increasing sea levels. They get it. They're the ones who are actually adopting things now that are trying to mitigate climate change. So I think it's going to be, again, a kind of a bottom-up thing. It's going to have to trickle up to...
Plus, you have your multi-state country, and then you have multiple countries in the world. It's really hard to come down with an agreement, especially it's easy for a developing country to see, for all the developed country, you're already rich by burning fossil. Yeah. For the past 50 years. Now you just put a regulation on nobody burn any fossils. That basically means stop growing as a country, right?
That's a valid argument. And I think I think the Paris Climate Agreement was not perfect, but they tried to address those issues. Yeah. And that's why it was sad to see the United States pull out of that. Because we are the leader in potential change. We're also the leader in the problem. So we need to be at the middle of that, I think, morally.
Yeah. Because I was born and grew up in China. So when I was born, like back in 1990s, we don't have much, I would say, like, stuff, basically. So everybody saved like crazy. It's like the first time I came to America, I just can't believe it. Like, people leave the conditioner on when they're gone. The whole building they just open the conditioner like day and night.
Yeah.
They put that thing at like a 60 degree or 68 degree in summer.
Yeah.
That would sound crazy to me. And you got all electricity you can use without paying, and you got all this kind of hot water and cold water thing, which I could never imagine back in China.
Right.
And then people print, like, I don't know how to even see that. It's just like they came back with like 40 pages in there, and just the whole thing was printed wrong. They just throw it away.
Yeah.
So when I was growing up, it's just like everybody's saving like crazy. Even now, like China, like every time you leave a room, you close the light, not for your good behavior or anything. It's simply just to save the electricity, because we still think that's a valuable resource.
Right.
But I can see that thing as like a cultural thing, because we have been keeping that thing for like the past 5,000 years, because people are just in generally poor back in China.
Yep.
We got probably like every 3 years, got 1 million people just die from famine.
Right.
So we know the scarcity of food.
Yeah.
We know the scarcity of everything. So we kind of like planted that into our culture.
Right.
And yeah, I understand all your concerns. For
Right.
me, I still don't observe it. It's just like then people, especially when they're like printing like crazy. It's just like I couldn't get the mentality out of it.
I don't think our nature has changed much. But actually, I'll ask you, when was the last time you were back in China?
That was 2009.
Okay, because I've heard it's changed a lot.
Oh, it changed a lot.
Like
People now are consuming like crazy.
Right.
And think about the population base.
Yep, and they're the leading producer of greenhouse. They just passed the United States.
If you think about it, like we got probably 6 times or 7 times bigger population than the United States, but now everybody in China wants a car.
Right,
like,
exactly.
Not one car, actually. They want 2 cars, just because whatever American does, we do.
Right.
So if they have 2 cars, we have 2 cars.
Right.
You don't even understand. You don't have a house. Why do you want 2 cars?
Right.
You don't have enough road. I can give you some numbers, just like in Beijing, right? People are buying cars like crazy, such that you need to have a special tag to be able to drive the car on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then you need another tag to drive it on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday.
Yeah.
So,
So I guess, my point is,
Yeah.
I think you're right. China for a long time was very conservative with their spending and energy use and all that. But they've gone through a huge change now. And that's one of the concerns, is if a country that size,
the population that size especially.
And I think they're starting to get some pushback now too, that the environmental quality had gotten so bad, the air quality, that they're investing heavily now in wind and solar, trying to get the coal plants down.
The confidence I have in back in China was, China's government has a really strong control. So if they say, hey, by 2020, we cut our emission by half, we can do it.
Yep. No, I agree with that. But you need the government to be doing.
The government is like, as long as they're starting doing stuff, like nobody's gonna. I don't think anybody's gonna even complain. It's just like, well, back then we enjoyed the policy. Now it's our chance. It's actually our turn to suffer.
Right. Yeah.
So it's fair.
Yeah.
It's usually those kind of, like Manu said, we won't have like protest to say like, well, you're just asking us to sell our cars or anything. We won't have anything like that. We're just like, okay, if this is what the government wants, we just do it.
Right.
So I think the agreement is probably going to be the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Across different countries. Otherwise, like if one country is doing this, other countries are just like, why are we doing this?
Well, we're actually seeing that. So with the current administration, they're rolling back a bunch of environmental laws. And actually, the businesses that should benefit from that are actually pushing back. So if you probably follow in California, they're trying to lower the car mileage limits. So they're in 4 different automakers made an agreement with California, and they're going to keep California's levels, which are higher. So the car companies actually they don't want to have to build cars at 2 different levels, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to build a fleet of cars that has a 40 mile per gallon average and one that has 30. They want to go with the 40. And they said as long as all the car companies have to do the same thing, it's a level playing field, that's what they'll work with. The same thing with oil and gas. They just tried to lower the emission standards for methane to make it so they could release more methane. And the natural gas companies said, no, we want to keep them where they're at. They want everyone to have to keep it regulated, and they know if it's going to have any future as a green energy when the next administration's in, they need to have those regulations under control. They also don't want to waste it. They don't want to waste the methane. So you're actually even starting to see now the businesses that in the past you think would have wanted these lower regulations are pushing back when they're trying to get them lowered. So I think that's some hope as well. I wish it was coming from the top down. But the fact that it's coming from the bottom up probably means it has more staying power.
Yep.
So if citizens and states and governors and mayors and the public are all saying we want these standards, then they're going to happen. I mean, if you look back to the 80s with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, those came from grassroots organizations. That was citizens.
So bottom up too, right?
The bottom up. That was citizens saying, California was the big one for the Clean Air Act. They had such bad smog that you couldn't.
San Francisco.
Yeah, you couldn't breathe in L.A. Yeah, and the Clean Water Act was a lot from the Midwest. There were rivers catching on fire in Erie, Pennsylvania, and things like that. And because raw sewage was getting dumped out into the rivers, and people said no.
They're right last thing now in the economic textbook. It's just like, right?
Yeah.
Pollution is a big factor.
Yeah, but those were big. The things at the time, people said, oh, it's going to kill the economy. We have to blah, blah, blah. That was all fine. I mean, it increased the cost of things, but people now can breathe the air and they can drink the water. So I think that's what it's going to take. Again, my concern with all this, I think in spite of the fact of being told about it for 40 or 50 years, I have a hunch we're past the tipping point. I think they talk about the new normal, and there's some scientists who are saying we can't even call it that yet because we haven't even hit a plateau. We just keep seeing temperatures go up, and they think that's going to probably happen for another couple decades before we even hit a plateau where it's the new normal. Okay. So we're not even to the new normal yet. We're still on the upslope.
And with all this kind of thing, you still think we shouldn't try to go to Mars as a priority?
No, actually, I don't think so. Yeah, because I honestly
still believe we can turn back, huh?
Well, I don't know if we can turn back. I think that what we probably need to start focusing on is how are we going to adapt to a new extreme environment for humans. To go back to our original topic,
is that even feasible? Like, let's say the temperature raised by 2 degrees.
Yeah. So there are parts of the world that, based on, and again, this is not was my understanding of other people's research, but there are probably parts of the world that are going to become uninhabitable, either because of high sea levels or they're going to become too hot to where we can't even do agriculture and people just aren't going to be able to live there. So it's going to concentrate the world's population at the same time it's going up. So that'll be a challenge. A lot of our big cities are along coastlines, and we're already seeing problems with that. But if the sea levels even go up 10 feet, they're
I went to Louisiana like 5 years ago, and then revisited it just like, no.
Well, in Louisiana, it's big, but they're the whole eastern seaboard, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, right?
Are they already at the critical level?
Well, there are parts of Manhattan that, with what was the hurricane that went through? I can't remember now. The one
Larry,
the one that hit New York, and the storm surge came high enough it flooded all the subways.
Oh,
right,
okay.
And that was 10 years ago.
Yep.
I think it was Maria, maybe. I get them all mixed up. Anyway, so sea levels go up another foot, and that could happen on just a big storm. So all the infrastructure that's built into a city like that starts to get to where it floods every couple of years, and those businesses, they're either going to have to shut down or build ginormous seawalls or something. Those are not far off. Those are, I think, things that we will deal with because it's going to be on the upslope. For climate change is going to keep happening even if we shut off additional CO2 production. Yeah, it's going to keep happening for decades. So I think we should be putting our resources into changing human behavior to mitigate the risk, but at the same time, we're going to have to start focusing a lot on how do we adapt. And it's not so much, I worry about the rest of the critters on the planet, but I think we're actually making it where it's going to be inhospitable for us to live as well.
Because I recently talked to several people from economics, and all of them mentioned like the new trend about behavioral economics. It's more about like using the same kind of resource to get more out of it just by changing the way you do it to adapt to human needs and human desires and all the stuff. So sounds like
No,
Hopefully.
I think there's something there. Definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good.
Well, we already hit like an hour and a half.
Okay.
So how about we just call it for a day?
That's good. That's good for me. I think you got everything I know.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for joining us again.
Oh,
that was very
Well,
interesting.
thank you very much. That was good.